Why don't you just disappear? Shayla asked, her tone sharper than the edge of the champagne flute she was pretending not to break. My mother didn't say a word. She just smirked like I was the one causing a scene in the house I helped pay off. I placed the folded table napkin back down without touching my food. Then I stood up, pushed in my chair, and left without raising my voice, without looking back. I guess every story has a crack where the silence finally leaks. Mine happened in that old coastal home in Charleston, South Carolina, the one with the green shutters I painted myself 2 summers ago when the wood started to peel and no one else noticed. My name is Melissa Joan, 35 years old, former COO of an education technology startup that went from a kitchen idea to a national platform serving low-income students. But before I ever had investors or users, I had Marcia and Shayla, my mother-in-law, and her daughter, who once said they didn't believe in tech, but would still support whatever it is I did online. I didn't grow up with either of them. Marcia married my father when I was 13, right after my mother died. At first, she tried. She baked sourdough, asked about my day, framed one of my piano recital photos, and placed it on the mantel. But everything shifted after he passed away during my first year at Columbia. The morning after the funeral, Marcia didn't ask if I wanted breakfast. She asked if I could help cover the mortgage since I was the only one with income now. So I did. I took my part-time tutoring gig and extended it into nights and weekends. I deferred a semester. I cooked. I fixed her broken sink. I picked Shayla up from school when Marcia worked late. It became less of a family and more of a quiet arrangement, me holding the foundation while they decorated the upstairs. Still, I believed that loyalty meant something. I believed that showing up in the hard parts would eventually earn me a place in the soft ones. Maybe that's why I didn't see it coming when they began to write me out of the story I built. After college, I returned to Charleston and started what would become LearnLoop, a low-bandwidth tutoring app designed for communities with weak Wi-Fi and underfunded schools. The idea came to me while helping Shayla study for her GED, her third attempt. I realized the problem wasn't her intelligence, but access. The app was small at first. I coded at night, worked hospital shifts during the day, and spent weekends training volunteers. When the platform was finally stable enough to pitch, I brought on 2 friends as silent advisors. Marcia offered to host early funder meetings in the living room. Shayla sat in on Zoom calls and helped with branding by suggesting colors and fonts. I didn't think twice about credit. I was too focused on functionality, on the mission. But credit is a funny thing. When you give too much of it away, people start believing it belongs to them. By year 2, we had seed funding. By year 3, we were in pilot programs across 6 districts. And by year 4, my name was quietly removed from public founder listings. They said it was a strategy decision, that investors liked a simpler narrative, that family-led brands performed better in Southern education markets. At the time, I was too busy troubleshooting a server crash during midterm week to argue. I let it go until the day of the grant ceremony. That day, I showed up at our old high school library wearing the same navy blazer I'd worn to our first pitch competition. I thought I was there to say a few words and hand over laptops to graduating seniors. But the program listed Shayla as founder and CEO. Marcia was community chair. My name appeared nowhere, not even in small print. That was the first time I felt like a ghost in something I had built. I confronted them privately. Shayla shrugged and said I had always been too intense about ownership, Marcia said. You're still family. Titles don't change that. But they did. Because when people stop saying your name in public, it's only a matter of time before they erase it in private too. What I didn't know then was that they weren't just pushing me aside. They were replacing me one silent file transfer, one photo crop, one document amendment at a time. The only reason I found out was because I stopped by the house to drop off Shayla's old hard drive. I walked in and noticed the wall above the staircase. Every photo was changed. One of me and my father fishing gone. The old team picture from our first app test, gone. In its place, Shayla in blazers. Marcia shaking hands with city officials. My empty chair blurred in the background. I tried to laugh it off that day. I made small talk. I accepted a mimosa I didn't want. Then came the brunch. Shayla sat across from me and complained about how hard it is carrying the whole company's weight. Marcia nodded, her smile thin as the china, and then, just as I asked if they needed help with the upcoming grant report, Shayla didn't even look up from her phone. She just said it, casual and clipped like a punchline she had practiced. Why don't you just disappear? Marcia didn't flinch. She just smirked and took another bite of quiche. I didn't answer. I didn't argue. I stood up, folded my napkin, and walked out the same door I had unlocked 300 times. That morning, something broke, but not in me. Something broke in the lie we had all agreed to live inside. And once you stop pretending it's your home, you start to notice how long you've been renting your own seat at the table. I didn't leave with a plan. I didn't even grab my jacket. I just drove. Past the old library we used for our beta tests. Past the coffee shop that let us use their Wi-Fi when our home connection kept crashing. I ended up parked near the church downtown where we once held our first volunteer training. The building was dark, but the streetlights cast just enough glow to reflect off the windows. And for a second, I saw my own face looking back. It didn't look angry, just hollow, like someone still trying to understand what had been taken, not just in words, but in history. In the beginning, Learn Loop wasn't even meant to be a business. It was a side project born out of frustration. I was tutoring Shayla through pre-algebra and realized how little she retained because of gaps in comprehension, not intelligence. When I tried finding platforms with visual tools and adaptive feedback, most either required expensive subscriptions or assumed students had private devices. So I mocked up a solution myself using simple modules that could run on basic Android phones. Shayla didn't say thank you. She said the colors were ugly. Still, she passed the test the next week. That small win kept me going. I spent nights coding after my hospital shifts, using donated devices and borrowed testing time from a school contact in Colombia. When I finally got a prototype stable, I applied for a local community innovation grant. I didn't win, but one of the judges referred me to a foundation in Atlanta that supported women-led educational tools. The call that changed everything came in at 6:13 p.m. on a Tuesday. I remember because I was boiling pasta and almost let the pot overflow. We got our first $10,000 with one condition: they wanted a family-based leadership story to boost relatability in the media. I hesitated. Marcia offered to be the mother figure, and Shayla, the young adult using the tool. I agreed, because I thought it was optics. I didn't think it would stretch beyond one press release. I was wrong. After that first article, things moved quickly. The platform gained traction. Shayla was invited to speak on panels, and Marcia started introducing herself at local events as the visionary behind LearnLoop. I thought it was harmless. They were helping in their own way. I convinced myself it didn't matter who held the mic as long as the work got done. But names do matter, especially on legal paperwork. When we applied for the Series A funding, I was so buried in infrastructure updates and user feedback tracking that I let Marcia and Shayla handle the media filings. They offered to submit the paperwork for the new parent entity, saying they'd keep me looped in. I didn't read the fine print. I didn't notice that my founder title had shifted to operational consultant. I didn't question why I stopped being copied on emails from the board. And when I asked about a press release that credited Shayla for architecting the core experience, Marcia told me to stop being petty. That word stayed with me for weeks. Petty. As if wanting to be acknowledged for building something from the ground up was some kind of immaturity. The thing with quiet contributors is that we often don't realize we've been cut out until the applause fades and we're standing backstage holding the receipts. I found mine in the form of a deleted Dropbox folder, one I had created years ago to track early testing data. It had been scrubbed and renamed, all screenshots of student surveys I collected, the budget spreadsheets I maintained. The first pitch deck I made in Canva, it was all gone. I asked Shayla about it, and she laughed. She said, "We're just streamlining. You hoard everything like a digital grandma." I went quiet after that, not because I accepted it, but because I didn't know how to push back without looking like the bitter ex-partner to the world's new favorite mother-daughter duo. Even the platform branding had shifted. What used to be looping education forward was now legacy learning, powered by Shayla. I stared at that tagline on a flyer once, posted outside the same school where I first ran testing. I remember standing there, watching a parent snap a photo of it, smiling like they believed in what it stood for. I almost believed it too, until I realized I wasn't even mentioned in the fine print. No trace, no initials, not even a thank you. Still, I stayed, not in the meetings, not in the media, but in the background, fixing bugs, responding to back-end issues at 2 a.m. from a burner login. The platform was growing, the impact was real, and I didn't want to sabotage it just to feed my ego. But ego is not the same as identity. And when identity gets erased long enough, even silence starts to feel like complicity. That's what I was thinking as I watched my phone screen glow with a news update that evening. Shayla had been selected as a keynote speaker at a tech summit in Atlanta. The title read, "Young Founder Reshapes the Future of Education." My name wasn't in the article. Again, that night, I didn't cry. I opened my laptop and started looking for something else, not attention, not revenge, just proof that I had been there. The next morning, I woke up in Declan's guest room with that strange kind of stillness that doesn't feel restful. The blinds were half open, letting in a sliver of light that made the dust in the air visible. I hadn't touched the suitcase I threw into the back of my car the night before, hadn't opened my laptop, hadn't told anyone I was gone. No one had texted, not Marcia, not Shayla, not even one of the interns I had mentored for 2 years straight. It was the kind of silence that doesn't feel accidental. It feels orchestrated. Declan had already gone to work. He left a note by the coffee machine. "Help yourself to breakfast. You're not alone." I smiled faintly, more out of habit than comfort. The kitchen smelled like oranges and dry toast. I couldn't remember the last time I ate without checking Slack between bites. But that morning, I didn't check anything. I sat with a cup of black coffee and thought about that last brunch. The way Shayla didn't even blink when she told me to disappear. The way Marcia's smirk felt rehearsed, like they'd been waiting for that moment, like I had just played my part right on cue. Something shifted in me that morning, not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet internal lock clicking shut. I no longer wanted to be invited back. I wanted to understand what had already been taken. I opened my laptop and signed into our old shared email account, the one we used in the early days of LearnLoop to handle donations, school partnerships, and beta testing notes. It hadn't been active for months, but my login still worked. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I knew what I didn't see. My name, my signature, my trackable role. Every email was now signed from Shayla or Marcia. Documents once stored under my cloud folder had been relabeled. The first investor intake form had been amended. The date field remained the same, but the prepared by tag now listed S. Harmon. I had filled out that form myself at 2 a.m. on a Sunday 3 years ago. I remember, because I had to Google half the legal terms and triple-check the capitalization on our state registration ID. I stared at the altered PDF for a long time, the cursor blinking on a copied version saved to my desktop. I didn't feel rage. I felt confirmed. Someone had rewritten the story. I just didn't know how deep the revisions went. By mid-afternoon, I drove to the county registrar's office. The building sat behind a faded courthouse and smelled like paper and mildew. The clerk at the front desk looked up when I asked for the articles of incorporation and founding partner records for LearnLoop LLC. She tapped a few keys, then slid a printed copy across the counter. The paperwork showed Shayla and Marcia as co-founders. I wasn't listed as anything, not even administrative support. No equity, no title, no presence. I checked the registration date. It matched the month I had been hospitalized for pneumonia. I remembered it because I had asked Marcia to file an extension form for our nonprofit license while I recovered. She had told me not to worry. She said she'd handle it. I guess she did. Back in the car, I didn't cry. I just sat there and let the sun heat up the dashboard. I scrolled through old notes on my phone, screenshots of wire transfers from my account to cover domain fees, early design contractors, a $5,000 loan I sent from my emergency fund to pay for the first round of data privacy audits. I had never asked for reimbursement. I had always believed the mission was greater than the math, but it wasn't just about mission anymore. It was about erasure, systematic, silent, and legal. Later that evening, Declan came home and found me typing on his living room floor, surrounded by printed contracts and crumpled sticky notes. He didn't interrupt. He just placed a grilled cheese sandwich beside me and left again. That's the thing about people who've been erased before they can spot the signs. And they know when you're not ready to speak, but need someone to stay anyway. I dug deeper that night. I called Greg Morton, one of our first backers who had since moved on to another venture fund. He had always been transparent and kind, the kind of man who asked about your family before talking numbers. He remembered me immediately, said he was sorry to hear about the mess. I didn't tell him what had happened. I just asked one question. On record, who did your firm list as LearnLoop's founding contact? He hesitated. Then, Shayla, but I remember meeting with you. You pitched it, not her. I thanked him and hung up. That was all I needed. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a clerical error. It was a rewrite, quiet, deliberate, and complete. They had done what most people in power do when they feel untouchable. They signed their names on top of someone else's labor and called it legacy. And I had let it happen because I trusted them, because I believed family didn't need contracts, because I thought loyalty was stronger than legality. I was wrong. I didn't rage. I documented, I printed, I time-stamped. I began building a file not for revenge, but for reference, because I wasn't going to ask for my seat back. I was going to prove it had never been theirs to give. The week that followed passed without sound, but not without weight. I moved through Declan's apartment like a guest in my own timeline. I worked quietly in the corners of his space, organizing receipts, sorting emails, labeling USB drives, and saving screenshots into a folder I named Ledger. I didn't call it revenge or defense. It wasn't that clean. It felt more like triage, preserving what was left of my name before they buried the rest of it in someone else's legacy pitch. One morning, I walked to the Co-op Cafe near the university campus where I used to run Learn Loop pilot sessions. It looked smaller than I remembered. The back wall was covered in photos of community projects, volunteers in matching shirts, teachers with armfuls of donated tablets. I recognized one of the pictures. Shayla was in the center, holding a grant check. Surrounded by kids smiling wide, I had coordinated that entire event, scheduled the school, confirmed the media release forms, hand-delivered the donated hardware. I wasn't in the frame, not in the caption, not in the credits, just another ghost behind a perfectly staged story. I sat with my coffee and opened the city's nonprofit grant portal on my laptop. The Learn Loop application was listed under Marcia's name. She had filed it 3 months ago, requesting a regional expansion under the Family EdTech Initiative. The program was slated to launch at the same local charter school where I had first taught coding workshops on weekends. They were using my lesson structure, my rubrics, even the name of the scholarship fund I created in my father's honor, the Joan Equity Award. No attribution, no acknowledgement, just appropriation in broad daylight. That evening, I spoke to someone I hadn't called in years. Her name was Tasha Fields, a quiet but sharp board member from the City Grant Ethics Committee. We had met once during a workshop I facilitated on digital inclusion. I remembered that she had stayed late to ask about infrastructure equity. She picked up after the second ring. I didn't launch into accusations. I asked questions about process, about who verifies ownership, about how grant money is audited. Tasha was patient. She told me that unless someone files a formal inquiry or presents direct evidence of misconduct, the office assumes good faith. She paused before saying the rest. But Melissa, if what you're saying is true, it's not just unethical, it's fraud. After the call, I sat in Declan's hallway and stared at the framed art leaning against the floor. It wasn't hung up yet. He said he didn't know where it should go. I understood that feeling. Being displaced from your own history makes it hard to know where to stand. I thought of my father that night, of how he used to joke that Melissa meant honeybee, and how I had always taken pride in the quiet work of building. I never wanted to be famous. I just didn't want to be erased. By Friday, I started logging times and dates, every transfer, every deleted message. I backed up archived emails and recorded walkthroughs of my original codebase. I cross-referenced dates on invoices with calendar entries from 2 years ago when Marcia claimed Shayla led product testing. She hadn't even been in the country that month. She had been in Bali on a yoga retreat, the one she claimed changed her perspective on education. I remember because I had covered rent for both of them that month while they were gone. I printed everything, page after page of overlapping truths. Then I slid it all into a plain white folder, No labels, no name, not yet. The truth didn't need decoration. It just needed to be documented well enough that when the time came, it could stand on its own. Declan came home that evening with takeout and asked how I was feeling. I told him the truth, tired, but clear. He nodded like he understood and turned on a playlist that didn't ask for attention. We ate in silence, interrupted only by the hum of the microwave reheating a forgotten side. Later, I checked the news feed. Shayla had posted another photo of her beside a new mural at the LearnLoop Community Center. The caption read, "Proud to expand the family's mission. Legacy is a gift." I saved the post without comment. That weekend, I drove past the address listed on the grant paperwork for the expansion site. It used to be a rundown administrative annex. Now it gleamed with fresh paint, solar panels, and new signage with Shayla's name on a brass plaque. I sat in the car across the street and watched as a group of donors toured the building. One of them waved to Marcia, who was giving an animated tour beside a screen projecting LearnLoop's growth chart. The graph used data I had compiled, same font, same structure, same lie. I didn't go in. I didn't need to. I had already been there. The blueprints were mine. The platform was mine. And the truth, quiet, consistent, and steady, was still mine too. What I needed now wasn't a spotlight or a microphone. I needed the right moment, not to expose them, but to confirm myself. And I knew that moment was coming. A few days later, while organizing scanned invoices for a call with a nonprofit auditor, I noticed a number I didn't recognize in the financial logs. It was a direct wire for $25,000 transferred from the state's Department of Community Advancement. The name listed on the memo was Founding Partner Disbursement, M. Joan. My breath caught for just a second. I hadn't applied for any disbursement. I hadn't received anything. I followed the trail, cross-checked grant IDs, then logged into the government's public funding portal. There it was, plain and proud, a regional grant issued under my name for technological equity expansion across underserved school zones. The applicant of record was Melissa Joan, but the bank account attached to the deposit was not mine. I called the grants office under the pretense of confirming a detail for a tax form. The woman on the phone was polite but firm. She said the grant was active and had been marked as disbursed. When I asked which institution had received the funds, she told me it had been issued to the LearnLoop Growth Fund and that all filings were submitted through their compliance portal. When I asked who signed the fund request form, she paused and said, "A Marcia L. Harmon, listed as acting proxy with your written authorization." I didn't answer right away. I didn't even argue. I simply said, "Can I request a PDF copy for my records?" She emailed it while we were still on the phone. I opened the file in Declan's kitchen, standing barefoot on cold tile with the refrigerator humming behind me. Page 1 showed the application. Filed 3 months earlier, page 2 showed a forged digital signature in my name. My name, used for government money, disbursed to a fund I had no access to, built by a company that had erased me. I downloaded the entire packet, saved it into 2 folders, and forwarded one to my encrypted drive. Then I sat at the kitchen table, hands on the edge, eyes focused on the corner of the window where a crack had formed in the frame. It was tiny, barely visible, but growing, much like the space between who they said I was and who I had always been. I didn't call Marcia. I didn't message Shayla. I already knew what they'd say. They would call it a misunderstanding. They would tell me I signed off on it months ago. They would say the money was being used for a cause we all cared about, and maybe that's what made it worse. They wouldn't even feel guilty. They'd believe the mission justified the theft. As long as the kids got computers, they could sleep just fine. That evening, I walked through the quiet aisles of a local pharmacy. I wasn't there for anything urgent. I just needed air that didn't feel like recycled betrayal. As I stood by the seasonal aisle, a teenage girl asked me if I knew where the index cards were. Her voice was small but polite. I pointed toward the end cap and watched her walk away, arms folded tightly around a worn backpack. She reminded me of Shayla once before the grants and the panels and the curated photo ops. I used to believe I was helping raise her. Now I wondered if I'd just been training her. On the way home, I passed the main public library and saw the large Learn Loop banner stretched across the gate. Shayla's name was front and center again, labeled as founder in residence. The irony made my stomach turn. That library had once refused us meeting space when we couldn't afford the reservation fee. I had fundraised through bake sales and local raffles to rent it out. I had cleaned up folding chairs and emptied trash bins myself when events ran late, and now they had renamed the reading room after her. Back at Declan's, I took off my shoes and sat by the front window with the lights off. The neighborhood outside was still and quiet, a few porch lights flickering in the distance. I opened my laptop and began assembling a timeline, not for drama, not for court, for clarity, for accountability. I included grant filings, wire logs, altered PDFs, and screenshots of Shayla's public statements. I flagged the most recent grant that had used my name and listed the funding ID in bold. I attached it all to a document labeled Request for Review and addressed it to Tasha Fields at the City Grant Committee. I didn't send it yet. I read it 3 times. Then I minimized the screen and closed the lid. I wasn't afraid they would deny it. I wasn't afraid they would gaslight me. I was afraid they would normalize it, that the erasure would go down as a clerical error, a misunderstanding, a gray area lost in administrative shuffle. But if I kept letting it slide, I wasn't just letting them rewrite my role. I was agreeing to disappear. I stood up and poured a glass of water, my hands steady, my breath calm. Declan walked in from his room and looked at me quietly. "They used your name," he said. I nodded once, but they don't get to keep it. By the end of that week, the file was ready. I didn't rush it. Every item had been verified, time-stamped, cross-referenced. Every screenshot was accompanied by context. I had compiled emails, grant disbursement notices, original design files with my metadata, and even receipts from when I paid out of pocket for the hosting servers in the app's first year. There was no commentary, no emotional filler, just facts. The kind that didn't need to shout because they left no room to argue. I still hadn't sent anything, not to the grant committee, not to the auditors, not to the press. I was waiting for something I couldn't name. But I knew I'd recognize it when it came. Until then, I stayed quiet, observed more, kept collecting. I didn't want the story to end with confrontation. I wanted it to unfold like the truth always does, slowly at first. Then, all at once. That Sunday afternoon, I received a message from a former intern named Eli. He said he had seen my name listed in an old GitHub comment thread and asked if I was still involved with Learn Loop. I stared at the message for a while, unsure how to respond. I thanked him for reaching out and asked what prompted the question. He said he had just watched Shayla speak at an educational panel and felt something was off. She said she built the student scoring algorithm, he wrote. But I remember you explaining how it worked to me during onboarding. He added a screenshot from the panel's website. Shayla was introduced as the founder and lead developer. I was listed nowhere. That small message cracked something open. It wasn't the betrayal that stung. I had absorbed that already. It was the sudden realization that other people remembered. People I didn't prompt. People I didn't coach. That's when I knew it was time. Not for revenge, but for balance. The following morning, I booked an appointment with the city ethics office under the guise of a grant clarification. Tasha Fields met me in a quiet meeting room with wood-paneled walls and a flickering fluorescent light above the doorway. She didn't ask for a dramatic story. She didn't interrupt. She let me slide the folder across the table and watched as I opened it page by page, guiding her through each section with the same calm I used to use during orientation sessions. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and exhaled slowly. "This is clean," she said. "And it's damning." I nodded. "I'm not asking for a lawsuit." I told her, "I just want the record corrected. I want the funding trail reviewed. And if the money was misused, I want it stopped before it spreads." She didn't make promises, but her silence carried weight. When I left the office, the air outside felt colder, but my breathing was easier. That afternoon, I received an email from a different address, City Audit Review at Charleston, Gov. It was brief and clinical. A formal review had been initiated regarding the LearnLoop community grant and associated disbursements. I didn't forward the message to anyone. I didn't post about it. I just saved it and kept moving. That same night, I drove past the boutique that Marcia had opened recently. It was nestled on a quiet block, the kind of place you only find if someone recommends it. In the window was a display featuring heritage-driven education tools for mindful families. The branding looked familiar. Too familiar. There were posters printed on thick matte stock with minimalist design. The fonts were pulled from the same deck I had once curated for LearnLoop's visual identity kit. In the corner sat a canvas tote bag with the phrase, "Teach, Trace, Transform." It had been our first campaign tagline. I still had the original sketch saved in my notes from 3 years ago. Seeing it like that, stitched into fabric, tagged with a $28 price label, wasn't painful. It was clarifying. I walked inside and browsed like a stranger. Shayla wasn't there, but a young assistant greeted me kindly. The air smelled like lavender and burnt cedar. In the back corner, I found a framed certificate on the wall that read, "Community Award for Innovation in Education," with Shayla's name embossed beneath. Below it was a short blurb about the founding vision of a mother and daughter team. I didn't react. I just smiled faintly and left. Back in the car, I opened the audio recorder on my phone and began speaking slowly, clearly, documenting the date, time, and description of everything I had seen. I didn't plan on using it for anything public. I just wanted it saved, for myself, for memory. Because truth sometimes needs witnesses, even if the only one listening is you. Later that evening, Declan handed me a mug of warm tea and asked if I was okay. I said yes, because I was. Not in the loud, triumphant way people expect when someone fights back, but in the steady way that comes from knowing exactly who you are, even if no one else says it out loud. I didn't need headlines. I didn't need applause. I needed clarity, and clarity, once earned, is a quiet kind of freedom. The following week, while archiving copies of grant filings on an external drive, I came across an old spreadsheet saved under a generic folder called Loopback Planning. It wasn't something I remembered creating recently. When I opened it, the sheet led to a hyperlink tucked inside the notes of cell B14. The link redirected to a long-abandoned project management board from our earliest days, a Trello archive that hadn't been touched in years. I had used it to track tasks when it was just me, 2 volunteer coders, and a handful of public school teachers willing to beta test the app for free. The access email listed on the account was my original admin handle, one I hadn't used since we migrated to the official domain. I clicked Forgot Password, entered the recovery info, and waited. When the reset email landed in my inbox, I took a slow breath before opening it. Something told me this wasn't just a login. It was a door that had been quietly shut behind me years ago. I stepped through it. Inside the archive, everything was still intact. Every card, every list, every team comment. My name showed up on nearly every single entry, from the bug triage columns to grant writing checklists. There were time-stamped entries of me uploading the platform's first UI mock-ups. I had even scanned in my handwritten notes from one of our early whiteboarding sessions. Marcia's name appeared just once, on a task labeled Confirm Lunch Catering for School Board Meeting. Shayla's name never showed up at all, not even once. I spent the next 2 hours downloading each board in PDF format, preserving the metadata. I added them to my ledger file, then opened another browser window and searched for the LearnLoop public website. It had recently been redesigned. The colors were more polished. The language softened for branding. The About page listed Shayla as the founder and Marcia as architect of growth strategy. Below that, a timeline showed the development of the app from 2018 to now. My name wasn't included at any point. What caught my eye, though, was a quiet line at the bottom of the page, a privacy policy disclaimer stating that LearnLoop held a shared email inbox from 2019 to 2022 for public-facing inquiries. I had helped create that inbox. I remembered the password convention we used. I tried the last format I could recall, and the login screen blinked once before letting me in. Inside were thousands of archived messages, untouched, unfiltered, and forgotten. It was like opening a sealed room in a house you helped build but had been locked out of. I found original investor threads, partnership proposals, school district MOU drafts, and in those emails, I found proof. Emails between me and city officials coordinating launch permits, notes to a teacher who couldn't get her students logged in because the Wi-Fi was capped, responses to press inquiries during the week. We reached 10,000 users. I found an email I wrote to the Department of Education pilot coordinator, explaining how our app worked offline and could be used in emergency shelters. That email had been forwarded to the press and used in a quote that Shayla later took credit for. I copied everything, not just the content, but the headers, the metadata, the forwarding paths. I didn't want interpretation. I wanted sequence. Truth doesn't always live in what's said. It lives in when, where, and by whom it was said. That night, I sat at Declan's small dining table with my laptop open and the email threads glowing on screen. He walked in with 2 mugs of warm broth, handed one to me, then pulled up a chair without asking any questions. I showed him one of the earliest emails, a note I wrote at 2:17 a.m., thanking a donor who had given us 5 refurbished tablets. The email was signed, with gratitude, Melissa Joan, founder, lead designer. Declan read it slowly, then looked at me. "That's a real signature," he said. I nodded. "They didn't delete me." I replied, "They just assumed I'd forget to remember myself." I didn't post the emails. I didn't share them publicly, but I printed them. I created a timeline. I matched the dates of those emails to the dates on LearnLoop's public-facing records. I created a grid showing which achievements had been shifted, reworded, or reassigned. The discrepancies weren't minor, they were strategic, and they were clearly documented. What I felt in that moment wasn't victory, it wasn't even relief. It was something quieter and stronger, the kind of stillness that comes after a storm when you finally hear your own voice again and realize it never really left. It had just been buried under someone else's performance. I closed the laptop. I placed the printed timeline into a new folder labeled Source. Then I made tea, turned off every light in the room, and stood by the window in silence. This wasn't about getting even. It was about reappearing on the record. The invitation didn't come directly. It never does in stories like mine. It was forwarded through Declan. Passed from a city mailing list I used to be part of before I was quietly removed. The subject line read, "Celebrating Women Who Build Legacy and Innovation in Education." The event was hosted at the Charleston Conservatory, a space I knew well. I had organized a fundraising roundtable there years ago for an early access pilot. Back then, I was listed as a guest of honor. This time, I wasn't mentioned at all. The featured speaker was Shayla Harmon. The description called her a visionary founder, bridging gaps in digital equity. Beneath her name, Marcia was listed as community steward and strategist at the bottom of the program. I saw a name I hadn't heard in a while, Councilwoman Lenore Bryant. She had been one of our earliest allies, someone who once pulled me aside after a panel and said, "You're too quiet to be overlooked, but they'll still try." I remembered that sentence more clearly than most compliments I ever received. I didn't RSVP. I didn't need to. People like me don't get invited. We're just supposed to understand the message behind the omission. But I still pressed my dress shirt, still backed up my files, still walked into that hall at 6:27 p.m., sharp with a small leather folder in my hand, and no intention of making a scene. The entrance was lined with soft uplighting and framed portraits of the evening's honorees. Shayla's face smiled from every corner. A looping video montage played near the bar. I recognized most of the footage. I had filmed some of it myself. My hand wasn't visible, but my absence was. I didn't greet anyone. I moved toward the back of the room and found a chair near the sound booth. I watched as guests arrived in polished blazers, nodding politely, exchanging rehearsed admiration. When the host introduced Marcia and Shayla, the applause was polite but warm. They took the stage like they had done it before. Shayla opened with a joke about her first coding project, one I had written for her in high school when she missed the assignment deadline. She never said my name, but she used my words. The presentation shifted to numbers, impact, partnerships. Screens flickered with charts and accolades. At the very end, Shayla clicked to a slide that read, "Legacy is a bridge, not a spotlight." She smiled and raised her glass as the room clapped. That's when I stood up, not fast, not dramatic, just enough for the movement to register. I walked to the side of the stage, handed a sealed envelope to a woman seated near the media table, and spoke clearly without a microphone. Before we close the night, I'd like to offer one more voice. A hush fell over the room, not stunned silence, but the kind that rises when everyone senses something real is about to break through the curated air. I opened a small Bluetooth speaker from my folder, tapped play, and stepped back. The recording filled the space with no reverb, no flourish, just clarity. It was Shayla's voice from an old strategy meeting. She had no idea I had saved the audio. She was laughing in the clip, saying, "Melissa built it, but we shaped the story." That's what people remember. Then came Marcia's reply, soft but sharp. Let her think it's still hers. people like her fade on their own. When the clip ended, I didn't speak, I didn't accuse, I just looked at Councilwoman Bryant and then turned to leave. Someone clapped once, then again. It didn't turn into a full ovation. This wasn't a movie, but it was enough to cut through the air. I didn't need applause. I needed the silence to shift, and it did. Outside, the night air felt sharper. I stood under the old elm by the conservatory gate and let my breath steady before walking back to the car. I didn't text anyone. I didn't post online. I had no need to explain what had just happened. The truth, when it lands, doesn't ask for validation. It just waits for someone to name it out loud. Back at Declan's, he didn't ask what happened. He just made tea, handed me the cup, and sat beside me like he had every night before this one. I set the envelope I had carried on the table, still sealed. It was addressed to the Office of Grant Oversight, containing every financial record, every altered filing, every piece of evidence now organized into a clean timeline, not for vengeance, for transparency, for the record, so that when someone looks back one day, they'll see not just a brand, but a builder, not just a legacy, but the woman who laid its first stone. By Monday morning, the ripples had started. I didn't know how far they'd go. I didn't expect them to go far at all. But truth, once spoken aloud in front of the right witnesses, never disappears quietly. That afternoon, a message landed in my inbox from a junior associate at the Office of Grant Oversight. It was brief, no salutation, no pleasantries. Acknowledged. Your file has been received and forwarded for internal review. You will be contacted if further verification is required. I reread that line 3 times, not because I doubted it, but because I understood what it meant beneath the words. I was no longer just watching from the outside. By Wednesday, someone forwarded me a screenshot of a revised listing on the city's grant recipients portal. The Learn Loop profile had been marked under review, and the contact section, previously showing Shayla's name, now read temporarily restricted pending confirmation. I didn't celebrate. I didn't forward it to Declan or post it anywhere. I just saved the image into my archive and continued with my day. That same evening, I passed by the old elementary school where I used to host tech literacy workshops on Saturdays. They had hung a new banner outside the main entrance. It read, "Education starts with honesty." I didn't know who chose the phrase. Maybe it was coincidence, but it landed like closure. The next day, I received a voicemail from Councilwoman Bryant's office. It wasn't from her directly, but her tone came through the assistant's words. She thanks you for attending the event. She believes your contribution deserves to be recorded properly. She invites you to speak at the Civic Integrity Series next month. I didn't return the call immediately. I let it sit for a full day before replying. Not because I needed time to think, but because I was learning to move at my own pace again. No more reacting. No more rushing to fix what others quietly broke. Meanwhile, Shayla posted a short video on social media. In it, she smiled carefully and spoke about the unnecessary confusion around recent accusations. She called it a misunderstanding, a miscommunication. She ended with a line about how community work is never perfect, but always rooted in love. I watched it once, without sound, then closed the app. I didn't feel anger. I felt confirmed. Deflection always sounds polished when it's rehearsed, but underneath, you can hear the crack. Later that week, I met with a pro bono financial auditor from a nonprofit advocacy group. She had seen my name mentioned in a civic integrity blog and reached out, offering to help. I showed her the ledger I'd built organized, dated, factual. She flipped through it slowly, then looked up and said, "They were sloppy." I shook my head. "No, they were confident." She nodded in agreement, which makes it easier to trace. By the following Friday, I received a formal notice from the Office of Public Funds Compliance. A grant freeze had been placed on the LearnLoop account. They requested in-person testimony to support the findings in the submitted file. I took a deep breath when I read that. Not because I was nervous, but because I hadn't realized how long I'd been preparing for that moment. I wasn't afraid to be seen anymore. Not as a shadow, not as a leftover, but as the builder I had always been. Quiet and steady, still standing after the story they told collapsed under its own weight. Declan offered to drive me to the meeting. I declined but thanked him. I needed to arrive on my own terms. I wore the same navy shirt I had on when we launched our beta app 3 years ago. It still fit, not because I hadn't changed, but because I had grown inside the same outline, deeper, sharper, quieter. At the hearing, I spoke plainly. No emotion, no commentary, just record after record, each aligned with time, transaction, and intent. No one interrupted. No one doubted. When I finished, one of the compliance officers said, "We appreciate your clarity." I nodded, thanked them, and walked out into the late afternoon sun. Back at Declan's, I didn't say much. I placed the final audit confirmation inside the same envelope that once held the original grant files. The seal had been broken, but now it held something complete. I set it on the bookshelf next to a small photo of my father, one I had restored from an old album. In the picture, I'm sitting on the front step, holding a crumpled certificate from a school science fair. He's beside me, not smiling for the camera, but looking straight at me. That look hadn't changed, not in memory, not in meaning. That night, I went for a walk through the old market district. The shops were closing. The streets were quiet. I passed the window of a boutique with posters still hanging from the last event. Shayla's face looked dim behind the glass. Below it, someone had taped a note. Handwritten on torn paper, it said, "Credit matters. No signature. Just those 2 words. A week after the audit hearing, I received a plain envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was a folded document marked "Final Determination," and beneath the heading was a single sentence confirming that the LearnLoop Expansion Fund had been found in breach of ethics and misappropriation policy. The city revoked future eligibility for Marcia and Shayla under all public funding streams for a period of 6 years, with a recommendation for community reimbursement. There was no apology, no public headline, no press statement, just a quiet administrative decision that landed like a quiet line in a very long book. I folded the paper once, placed it in the file where everything else lived, and closed the drawer without ceremony. That same afternoon, I went to the park downtown, the one where we used to host pop-up coding tents for after-school sessions. The benches had been repainted. The kids were different now, but the laughter sounded the same. I sat on the far edge where the sun hit the pavement in a patch that felt warm but not theatrical. It wasn't triumph, it wasn't revenge, it was clarity. The week after that, I stopped by my old apartment. I had kept the lease, though I hadn't returned since the day I left for Declan's. Dust had settled on the kitchen counter, and one of the light bulbs had gone out in the hallway. I didn't fix it. I just opened the windows, let the spring air in, and walked to the small drawer where I kept unopened letters and forgotten notebooks. I pulled out a small journal I used to keep when LearnLoop first launched. It wasn't full of dreams or strategies. It held notes like, update crash reports for version 1.3 and send Shayla's GED teacher a thank you gift. I flipped to the back and saw something I had written on a night I barely remembered. The handwriting was messy, but the words were intact. If they rewrite the ending, I'll just begin again at the part they skipped. That evening, I sat at my own table for the first time in months. No speeches, no timelines, just one cup of tea and the sound of quiet that didn't feel like absence. I placed a new notebook at the center of the table and opened to a clean page. I didn't title it. I didn't plan it. I just started listing names, mentors, volunteers, parents, students, every person who helped build what they tried to steal. The kind of list that doesn't need a press release. Only intention. Later that week, I received a message from a new civic tech startup based in Asheville. The founder said someone had forwarded her a blog post I was featured in and asked if I'd consider joining as a strategic advisor. I read the message twice, then I walked outside, let the wind touch my face, and thought about how long it had taken for a new chapter to arrive that didn't ask me to disappear first. I didn't say yes immediately. I didn't say no. I asked to meet in person, to hear the idea fully, and to see the people behind the words, because I had learned now that vision doesn't mean much if it doesn't come with truth. 2 nights later, Declan brought over dinner. We sat at the table I had once abandoned, now with the golden cloth napkin folded neatly in the center, like a flag of quiet reclaiming. He poured 2 glasses of water, looked at me, and said, "You did it." I shook my head gently. I didn't do anything special. I just didn't let them finish the story without me. He smiled and said nothing else. We ate slowly. No music, no screens, no discussion about what came next, because what came next didn't need to be loud. It just needed to be mine. Before bed, I placed the napkin back in the drawer, not out of habit, but intention. I wasn't folding myself away. I was placing something where it belonged. I thought back to that brunch, to the moment Shayla said I should just disappear, and to the way Marcia smirked like the decision had already been made. I remembered standing there, quiet but awake, and walking out without arguing. What they never realized was that disappearing isn't the same as being gone. Sometimes disappearing is just the first step in being remembered clearly. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is leave the frame and wait until someone notices the gap you never filled again. So now I'll ask you, not out of bitterness but clarity, have you ever been written out of your own story and quietly decided to write it back in